Okay, good morning, barely to everybody. My name's Don Hennon. I'm the Director of Risk Management and Claims for Crane. Welcome to the Pre-Employment Testing Seminar. Before we really get started, I do want to introduce my unit. I know a lot of you have called us and probably talked to us on the telephone a few times, so I thought it would be good to at least show the faces that you talk to every once in a while. So Monica is just coming in the door. She was managing the table. So here's Monica Rettel. She does primarily file reviews, work comp questions that you might have. Also, she does some building valuations, which you may not see, but behind the scenes from your broker, she does building evaluations. So it's Monica Rettel. Let's see, Brandon Putz. Where's Brandon? Where's he? There he is, Brandon Putz. Part of our loss control team, we have 3 loss control reps, Kevin Hoffman, and then our newest member is John Flynn. So that's the unit. If you guys call and have questions about claims or loss control, and we really want questions or issues or anything you have, please call us and use us. We're there for your services. So the seminar, pre-employment testing, this came about, we were doing a file review for a small company that hired what I would call an eggshell claimant. It's basically a claimant that's ready to crack. And this employee was with this company about a year or so, and of course had an injury. And it's a back injury which requires surgery. And it's a $200,000 claim, so it really affects a small business if you don't do pre-employment testing, which is really the only way you're going to pick something like this up. So we have 2 speakers today. Before we get to the speakers, though, I do have a joke. This is one of my few claim jokes. So we have an attorney that's deposing an injured worker, and he asked the injured worker, how high can you raise your arm since your injury? And the injured worker goes, I can only raise it this high. So the attorney goes, well, how high could you lift your arm before the incident? He goes, I could do all this. So you don't want to hire this guy. So we're here today to tell you how not to do that. So we have Kurt Hoekstra from Concentra. His background is he graduated from Oklahoma University, got his master's at WashU, and he's got his doctorate from St. Scholastica in Duluth, Minnesota. He's been a physical therapist for 25 years, 18 of which have been with Concentra. So he's going to tell you all the ins and outs of setting up your programs internally with Concentra as far as your pre-work or your pre-employment testing. We also have an attorney with us today, Shane Jones. Where's Shane at? There he is, from Tuathkene. Shane graduated from Oklahoma. No, not Oklahoma. Where? Oklahoma. And WashU, he has his law school from WashU. And he's with Tuathkene. They're the largest employment law firm in St. Louis, and they were just rated #1 by St. Louis Business Journal in 2018 for employment law. So we have very qualified speakers. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the seminar, and we're going to start off with Kurt.
So, yes, good? Yes, good. So I'm an old Big 8 guy, and I wonder if it was a little bit of a Big 8 slip, because I'm from Nebraska, I'm not from Oklahoma. And that's blasphemy to say otherwise. I don't know. I'm not trying to make that noise. Does that still work? Is it? Oh, no. Have that back. Is this Boomer sooner? Yes, a little bit. No, something. I think it's going. Yes. Okay. So anyway, I'm from Nebraska. I went to PT school at WashU also. So Shane and I are bears together, I guess. Anyway, I'm a dad, so I got a couple dad jokes. Spider-Man made a coat out of Greek bread. It's a pita parka. Yeah, they're not good. A Clydesdale, why did a Clydesdale give the pony some water? He was a little horse. So I'm here to talk to you about pre-employment testing. Thanks for putting up with my jokes. Musculoskeletal injuries is a big deal. These statistics from 2011 show that there were 2 million workers injured in that time, with 600,000 of them having lost time. The direct costs were 15 to 20 billion, that's with a B, but the indirect costs totally was 45 to 54 billion with indemnity costs, et cetera. And I would expect that that cost has gone up. So what can we do about that? How can we reduce some of those musculoskeletal disorders or injuries? There's a few things. Early reporting, early treatment is one thing. You can have wellness programs, pre-work stretching, that kind of thing. And I think that just kind of gets you a little bit more in tune with your body. You can also try to modify how people are treated. Maybe you do an on-site or use a triage nurse. But then you can also do pre-employment functional testing, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So in general, a pre-employment lift test can be quite simple. It could be a single lift if that is really the requirements that a specific job might need, or it can be quite extensive. And I'll go into that. So overall, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And So overall, and I'm going to say these last 4 bullet points a few times. The idea is that you're decreasing the number of injuries, you're decreasing the costs, you're decreasing the number of lost days, and then you're going to increase the retention. And for me, performing some of these tests, that's the part that didn't seem quite as intuitive or specific to me, in that when you do these tests, you're finding a better fit. Not only do you know that, can you still hear me? Not only do you, not only do you know that the person is a qualified candidate to do that job, but that maybe the retention is less also. They're just a better fit. We are guided by the EEOC and the ADA when we establish our tests. If the examination tends to screen out individuals with disabilities, it must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. I'd go back and point out that you can't discriminate, you can't pick and choose who does this test. Everyone needs to do this test for a specific job. You could maybe kind of see where an employer might want to test everyone to lift 100 pounds, even though they only have to lift 60. So you're guaranteed an extra strong employee, but that's not the way it flies. And the attorney can maybe speak to that more. I think I just said all this stuff. So speaking of defensibility, I won't get into much detail with this since Shane will probably touch on some of that. But you want to make sure that the test is defensible. The ADA says that you can rescind an offer if someone fails the pre-employment lift test because that poses as a direct threat to themselves. No, ADA is direct threat to others. EEOC then comes back and says you can rescind an offer if they're a direct threat to themselves. So direct threat to others, you could see maybe in a situation where 2 people have to lift a gurney, maybe a heavy beam. One person is unable to do it, the other person's left holding it. I've seen those patients. So, and sometimes it's just an accident. The other member slips and falls, they're left holding a heavy item, and they get hurt. So that's kind of how that works.
Sir.
Yes. Oh, and by the way, I'm glad you asked a question. Feel free to ask any questions. Yes, go ahead.
You said that the test has to be defensible. Should that be the business owner's responsibility to make sure? Isn't that the testing agency's responsibility? defensibility?
Yeah, I'm gonna give you some more detail on how it's defensible too, and it's all above. Yeah, so partially here, to make it defensible, you're going to use a third-party vendor. We create these tests at Concentra. There's other entities out there that do that too. So that's helping with that. You're not just creating this test, but a third-party vendor is doing it. It's a medical group or entity that's performing the test, so there's a certain level of credentialing or skill that's happening. It's their certification that helps protect you there. And you're following guidelines. I'll explain too that the employer also has to validate the test. Yeah, this is kind of the process you go through. So let's say you want to have a test created. One simpler way is if you have a pretty detailed job description, you can give that to us, and we can create a test that way, and that saves you a little bit of money in that job creation, or that test creation. If you don't have a adequate job description, or you don't feel confident in it, or maybe you just don't have one at all, we can come on site, we can measure the forces it takes to lift whatever they're lifting. They got to crank something, we can test that, push, pull, lift, climb, crawl. We can assess that and include that in your test. We would also, so then we send that to you, you'd take a look at it. Maybe you'd also have other people in the field that know these jobs better, look at it and make sure that this is actually what needs to be done. Maybe you tweak it and send it back to us and say, no, we really don't do that anymore. We should change that. And then we tweak it, send it back to you, and then you sign off on it and validate it. We won't do the test until you say, yes, this is accurate. That's what this slide just said. I'm going to speak a little bit. So we need to, it's our inherent responsibility as the administrator of this test to assess its success. Ideally, there's about a 25% failure rate. That's when we know that the test is probably doing what it should do. It's providing you the best candidate to do this job. Again, it's that proper fit. But that's a little tricky because the failure rate can be greatly influenced by the candidates that we get. Here's a couple examples. We did a test for a company. It was somewhat construction-like in business. In their title, it indicated they might have to do a lot of overhead work. They might be installing garage doors. And we would do this test for these candidates, and no one was failing. And they came back to us and said, hey, listen, what good is this test? No one's failing. We're not weeding anybody out. And we're still getting some injuries. Not very many, but they wondered what the value of the test was. They were sending very good candidates in. It was a hard test. They had to lift, I don't remember the weight, but it was significant, like 50 to 75 pounds up to 78 inches. And they could all do it. But if and all their candidates were in the construction business, in their title, it indicated you might be doing overhead work. So if I've got a shoulder injury, I'm not going to go work for a company that I know I'm going to have to do a lot of overhead work. So that's where the failure rate was low, but the candidates were excellent. And then, so can contrast that, we do another test. It's probably the hardest test I know that we do. It's for a grocery store distribution place. The job title is an order filler. These guys drive on little stand-up pallet jacks. They go all about the distribution center, and they're building a pallet for grocery stores. And so they start with the heaviest stuff on the bottom. They wear a head jack, and the next item they have to go pick, is into their headset, and it's timed. When we do this pre-employment testing for them, before they start, we give them a towel and a bottle of water because they're going to use both by the time they're done. They're sweating. It's timed. It's a 30-minute test. They have to get it done in 30 minutes. but it's heavy. The heaviest lift is 95 pounds, and they have to lift 65 pounds up to 72 inches. That company uses a hiring agency to send candidates to us. I think the requirement for them to come to us is, are you breathing and do you have a pulse? Because we'll look at some of these candidates and know that they most likely cannot lift 65 pounds over their head. And for some of these folks, we'll explain the test, what we're doing, and say, do you think you can do that? And maybe we let them know what 65 pounds feels like, and they're like, all right, no, I can't do it. So the failure rate with this client is high because they're just throwing as many people as they can to this position. Now, I don't completely blame them because the turnover rate is outrageous. It's 50-60% for this position because it's a very, very hard job. So there's different types of pre-employment testing. Again, we all have to follow the EEOC and the ADA guidelines when we're establishing those tests. One type of testing is isokinetic testing. These tests are set up. You go on site, kind of measure the forces that are needed to do a job. It's labeled as heavy, moderately heavy, moderate. And then you perform tests, essentially strength tests at different body parts. Often they test shoulder, knee, and then core or hip. And that's about it. Some of them are a little bit more detailed, but many are not. So you do the test. It calculates whether or not you're strong enough to do the test. And it says, yes, you could qualify. But therein lies kind of the leap. It just says that you're strong enough to perform this test, not whether or not you can actually do the test. I'd point out that this test does not usually use real-life tools and equipment. Full disclosure, I am completely against these tests, these isokinetic tests. I'll explain on some of the studies I have too where they somewhat fail. But maybe here's an example to illustrate it. So let's say you have to be able to lift 60 pounds from like mid-thigh to maybe waist height, all right? So you could do that test by squatting down and lifting, maybe just using your arms to put up to that level, okay? Some people could also bend forward, stand up with it, maybe use their calf muscles to get up to that level. It wouldn't be quite as biomechanically sound to do it that way, but this test doesn't measure calf strength. And so if you've got a bad knee and you prefer not to squat down, but you can adequately bend forward and perform the test, that's the nuance that the isokinetic testing doesn't allow for. The type of test that we do in our centers that most people use is a dynamic lift test. This test makes more sense. If you have to lift 60 pounds, have them lift 60 pounds. You got to crawl through a crawl space, have them crawl underneath an object so you know that they can do that. Push, pull, climb, etc. It just makes more sense to me. We sometimes we'll add a aerobic component to it. This is usually for groups that have to be in good shape, run, firefighters. We do a lot of border patrol tests, security guards. We have a test right now. It's not, we're not getting to a VO2 max with the test I'm talking about. Some of these others, though, we'll have them do a step test at a certain cadence. We'll measure their resting heart rate, compare it to a max heart rate, and then the heart rate that they get here, we have a formula that we can measure and find out their VO2 max, indicating whether or not they're in good enough shape to do this job. This other security job test we're doing now is quite new. They have to run 10 miles an hour for 10 seconds. That's fast. If you use a treadmill, I've tried it myself, and I think if I could see myself doing it, I'd look like the road runner. You know, your legs are just spinning as fast as you can. And right now that test is a 50% failure rate. My therapists are scared, concerned when they administer this test. And if someone is not, if they're not in shape, if they're not running, if they're not used to treadmills, we're extra careful. We've had someone fall off the treadmill. So we're still assessing if we're going to continue to do that test. So here's a study that says isokinetic testing can be helpful. I should mention the isokinetic salespeople are very effective. They'll make you, these machines will never let you have another injury. They'll make you smarter, taller, and your teeth whiter. Yeah, so here's, so in this study, in the pushing the wrong button. The subjects were able to lift more isometrically. So they were testing like a simulated lift with isokinetic machine, right? They have like a bar here, and you're just pulling up on it. You're not going through the full motion. You're just pulling as hard as you can here. So inherently, you can generate more force doing that. But they use a straight extrapolation that if you can generate 200 pounds of force doing this, you can lift 200 pounds. And that's not accurate. And so if that's your job, to lift that much, and you're throwing someone into that job, you're really setting them up to fail. They really cannot lift that much, but the test said it did. That's one of the limitations there. This top study, so I mentioned how that one machine I'm thinking of, they do three movement tests. They test their knee, extending and flexing, as kind of as fast as you can, as hard as you can. They test the shoulder just in this manner, as hard and as fast as you can. And then you're seated and you bend forward and backwards as hard as fast as you can. So what job do you do that you're doing this? But they're using that to say they had adequate back strength to do heavy lifting, and it's just a stretch. Yeah, this bottom test was in supportive of it. This top test showed that it was beneficial. This was more of the dynamic testing. This bottom test, and I'll speak about it later, too, showed that the injury rate was less and the retention rate was higher. Does everyone have access to these presentations? Okay, so all this data, all these studies are available to you, and there's a detailed reference list at the end, too. I won't bore you too much with this. There is one point that I wanted to make here that is another additional benefit, is when we administer these lift tests, we are also demonstrating proper body mechanics. And sometimes that's the only time that these candidates are getting that instruction. So it's nice. We have a guideline that if someone is unable to perform a lift with proper body mechanics, we will correct them 3 times. And if they're unable to do it that way, it's a fail. Here's a study that just supports the aerobic testing with those types of jobs that need that sort of testing. So kind of in summary, there's evidence to support why to do these tests. There's some costs associated with these tests. Setting up, having the test made, the equipment, etc. I mentioned earlier, there's a couple ways that these tests can be generated. If you have a specific, up-to-date job requirement, that's one way to do it, or we can have someone come onto your on-site and do that. It's cheaper, for us at least, if you send a job description in, than having someone go out. For us to send someone out, it's about $400. The range can be high here. And then there's the cost. So the employer's cost is really setting up the test and then having the test administered. We charge, we have 3 levels of testing. One, if it can be completed within 15 minutes, is less. A second level, if it's completed within 30 minutes, is our level 2. That's, I don't have these costs on the top of my head, but I think it's about $70 for a level 1 or 15-minute. It's about $90 for a level 2 or a half-an-hour test. Beyond that, it's $125 or something like that. I know our average charges for all of our testing this is about $81. Most tests are level 2. As a physical therapist, I don't want to spend extra time doing these tests either, so I like a shorter test. There are companies, I'm not very good at this. There are companies that this is what they do. This is their bread and butter. They go on site, they create these tests. They also help form a network of places that can perform these tests. Essentially everything that Concentra does, but they can do it and maybe find facilities in rural settings and make sure that there's more inter-rater reliability. They'll have a physical therapist in rural Missouri watch a video, make sure they have the proper equipment, make sure they do it, so that you as an employer have confidence that if they're going to one of these approved places, that the test is being done similarly. The providers of this have some cost, but really this is not passed on to you. We have the folks trained to appropriately go out and perform the testing, the equipment that's included. I think dynamometers. Oh yeah, force gauge. These force gauges are about $500 to $800. Something you can push so you know how much force is needed. There's going to be greater cost if you want night or weekend testing, or if you want us to come on site. So here are the bullet points that I said earlier too. The idea is that we're going to reduce your instance of work-related injuries, decrease your cost, decrease your lost work days, and improve your retention. Here's a few more studies that speaks to the cost benefit of it, not just the effectiveness of the test, but your return on investment. This study showed that for every dollar spent, there was an $18 return on investment. This study compared the folks that were screened versus unscreened. The folks that were screened, you can see there was a lower injury rate, there was a lower cost per employee, and the turnover rate was less as well. This is that same study that was done earlier, just pointed out that they proved that the incident of injury was less and that the retention was higher. This is a nursing group. They showed that they saved $4.5 million. I don't have the details of that, but that's a big number. So to repeat and to sum up, one more point I think I failed to make, but I think many of you know, these tests are not for light duty or office workers. Really something of moderate or heavier, per OSHA guideline is really effective at performing these tests. And again, if we're doing a test and no one's failing and it's really easy, we should be the first ones coming to you saying, yeah, this test probably isn't worth it for you. But I would just kind of repeat that it shows that pre-employment testing is effective. It can reduce your costs, especially when it comes to injuries. And it can find you the right fit. And then there's a whole lot of this. That's all I have. Any questions? Yes. Thank you. Yeah. In fact, I didn't tell you my role a little bit. I'm the Director of Therapy Services for Concentra. Recently we acquired US HealthWorks, so that increased our number of centers across the country up to 600 centers. We have 7 centers in St. Louis. We have 14 in Kansas City. I cover those areas as well as Nebraska and Iowa. We primarily do occupational health. That's really what we do. We do pre-employment testing like this. We'll do drug screens, physicals. If you get hurt at work, then you can also come to our center, see our physicians. And if it's musculoskeletal related, and there's a loss of function or strength, the AMA indicates that physical therapy is the best means of treatment for musculoskeletal conditions, and we have physical therapists on site too. So that's help manage those folks. Does that answer your question? I should have started with that. And actually, and there's some information. The center maps are out on the table out here. If you could get in contact with any of those centers, there's a small map too. And if you want my card afterwards, let me know. There was another question. I didn't mean to scare it off. Yes.
I had one. What about, we sometimes have people who show up and then the doctors say, well, they need a fitness for duty.
Fit for duty.
We don't automatically do that. Are there any guidelines for us to have a heads up when that's going to happen?
Yeah. When you have these tests in place in advance, it is really nice because we can just do that test. When you do not, and you have someone go out because they had a total knee replacement, not work related, and then their orthopedist says, yeah, you can go back to work now, but you're not sure if they're capable of doing the job. We're in a little bit of a tricky situation when we do not have this test established. The best that we can do, the physician will examine the patient. They may test his strength and range of motion, but he's leaning more on that orthopedist saying you're good to go. The physician may ask, what are your job duties? What do you have to be able to do? And then he can bring him over to therapy in conjunction with the physical therapist. They have to climb ladders. He can make them climb a ladder. They have to lift 60 pounds. We can do that. But it's our best effort, and it's a whole lot less concrete. Now, if you had a job description, that would be ideal in that situation. Yeah. And I should expand a little bit because sometimes we're put in a pickle. I talked about trying not to discriminate. Sometimes we'll have companies that call and say, hey, we want to set up a test for this one guy. And that's a slippery slope. If you do that, then you should be testing everyone for that same position. Yeah.
So everybody's looking for people. There's people doing the jobs. You hear stories about standards being lowered. I mean, you can hear there's a local company that's not disqualifying people to fail a drug test.
Yeah.
So what are you seeing?
Yeah. Well, in that one example, they're sending people.
How do you kind of get around that? What's the strategy? Because what's also missing is lost opportunity. The business you're losing because you're not getting the work that you're producing.
I know. That's a tough situation. I'd hate to be in your situation. You need the labor, and we see that fluctuate. We do testing for nursing homes also, and okay, and we'll fail some folks, and they'll call back and say, "Hey, can you do this test again? We think they're better now, and they should be able to pass." So essentially, they don't. They don't want to change. They want the employee, and so they probably coach that employee to, hey, you need to get better at this and this, so you can pass that test, because they're short on people too. Yeah.
So you mentioned a topic about stretching.
Uh-huh.
Process.
How does that go?
What ideas to try to implement those at your company?
Yeah, so we can have the same folks who design these tests that come out and measure the job site. Those same folks would come out. They would probably assess what are the different tasks done, muscle groups that need to be addressed more than others, and they can, depending on your scenario, they can train the trainers that may lead the pre-shift stretching, or they could maybe train your 15 people on the floor at that time, and kind of get that ball rolling. Does that answer your question?
Close enough. We've talked about it a couple times with our safety committee, we just never got it off the ground.
Yeah, and if you're a safety guy, maybe you just don't have the confidence to know what to do. As a physical therapist, we could just show you. And it's not very complicated. Again, I think the greatest benefit is when that person is going through the motions of stretching, they feel what's going on in their body, and they're just more aware of their body as a tool. And so when they're lifting, if something doesn't quite feel right, maybe I need to modify how I'm doing something. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for your time.
Okay, we're going to transition here. Brandon's going to switch the PowerPoint, and we're going to introduce Shane Jones from Two with Keeney. He's going to talk about the pitfalls that you have to be aware of from a discrimination standpoint. So there's some issues also that you have to be aware of.
I'm going to see. He said he was going to try this, and it sounds like it's working. Sounds good to you guys? Well, I don't know if it sounds good, but you can hear it. And I noticed that you guys gave Kurt an applause before he even got started. I know you guys know I'm a lawyer. No, you should wait. You should see if we earn it. I think that's right. I won't make the mistake that Kurt made, though. I'll go ahead and say I do have some materials that describe my law firm, Two with Keeney. They're sitting out there on the table as you leave. Please get one. That makes me feel better, like people took it as they left. I also have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, all the slides that I'm going to go through. I want to start off by saying, though, I appreciate the invitation that we got from Don and from Brandon, all the work that these guys have done to help put this together. This is valuable, and you guys are getting your money's worth, I hope. I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about why everyone in America doesn't just automatically run out and do all these tests. I mean, he makes them sound so good. Why don't we just run a test or 12 for every conceivable position that we have here at the firm? And the reason is that there are some real legal pitfalls. A couple of words about those things. The legal system that we're in encourages employees or people who've been wronged or feel that they have, it encourages those suits to be brought in the name of sort of like for the public good. They don't want employers to get away with evil discrimination. They don't want employers to get away with bias and prejudice. And so the system is set up to encourage people who feel that they've been wronged, whether they really have or not, to be able to bring those claims. Most recently, we've just seen that with sexual harassment, but it's true in a variety of sex discrimination, race discrimination, national origin discrimination, religious discrimination, age discrimination, and even disability discrimination. There are whole agencies set up within the government to help encourage and process those kinds of claims, like the EEOC, like the MCHR, like the IDHR, that's the Missouri and the Illinois equivalent. There aren't government agencies that are set up to defeat those claims. There aren't any agencies that are set up to tell people, no, you were not discriminated against. That is what you guys are up against. And as Don mentioned, my firm is the largest firm in St. Louis by count of employment lawyers. Many of you guys have never heard of us. We're mostly by word of mouth. We're not one of these big national firms, but there are plenty of big national firms operating in St. Louis. Our competitors, the guys who you guys use in many cases. And the thing is, that should tell you how many plaintiffs' lawyers there are, how many employees are bringing these kinds of claims. We're making a full-time job out of it. So are all those other guys. Well, who's doing the other side of the work? You guys have to start to think in terms of, I think, defensive driving, worrying about what could happen. How could a person intentionally take this wrong? How could a person accidentally take this wrong? What's the worst possible light they could put this test in? And when you think that way, I think it will come away with a better understanding of why you have to take some care in establishing these tests, and why there are so many rules and sort of ways to go about it, as Kurt was describing. I noticed that both Don and Kurt started off with a dad joke at the top, kind of a lawyer joke. Is that an informal rule? I don't have a dad joke, but I did hear that there was a kidnapping at school today. But it was okay. They woke him up. It's fine. You guys don't like them. What? How about a dad joke that's kind of a legal joke? What do you call an elephant that doesn't matter, Don? Anyone? Irrelevant. All right. Well, my kids like it. I've got 4 of them. Okay, a little piece of information about the firm and then a little bit of a disclaimer. We're going to talk about physical testing, which is the isometric test, the strength test, but the same legal concepts apply more broadly to something like IQ testing or cognitive testing, or for that matter, drug testing, or even fair credit reporting, running a credit report on someone. The same general rules apply, but that's all they are, they're general rules. Your mileage may vary. Your individual gas mileage depends on your individual driving habits, and you have to take care to get an attorney to talk with you about your specific situation in any particular case. The main rules to understand, and if you don't take anything else away from my presentation but this, you can't use a test that's discriminatory. You can't set up a testing system that's designed to weed out a certain category of person, a protected category. And you can't also use a test in a discriminatory way. So a test that's set up discriminatory, or a test that's not set up but it's being used in a discriminatory fashion. That's the thrust of the legal framework. And there are really 3 federal statutes that have taken us in this direction. I'm going to go over these 3 statutes. It's not going to be too boring. I'm going to give you some examples as we go, and my hope is that you'll have an appreciation for the rationale behind these rules instead of just trying to memorize what the rules are. I want you to understand why. Once you have a good sense of what the EEOC is looking for or what the plaintiff's lawyer is asserting, you have a better idea of what your defense needs to look like. So the 3 laws are Title VII, which is part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then we'll also talk a little bit about the ADEA, which came out just a very few years later in '67. And then much later, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA. Similar titles, but they're all adopted separately. Missouri and Illinois both have broadly similar statutes in their state law. And then the last couple things I'll talk about, and they're in the materials that are out there on the table, are the uniform guidelines that the EEOC and the federal government have put out. The uniform guidelines are kind of a safe haven. If you can describe what you're doing as being compliant with the uniform guidelines, and I have some EEOC materials there as well, then that's a good way to start your defense with an EEOC claim or with a lawsuit. Let's first talk about Title VII. As I mentioned, Title VII adopted in the early 60s and is part of the Civil Rights Act. So its primary thrust was race, color, creed, national origin, and sex. Title VII prohibits employment discrimination on this basis. It means you can't refuse to hire someone because they're black or Hispanic or because they're a Muslim or a woman. It means you can't decide that you're going to fire them for that reason, and it means that you can't refuse to promote them for that reason. If that's your reason, that's illegal. That's what Title VII says. It gets a little more nuanced because almost never does anyone now say, we don't hire blacks here. But you can still win a case as an aggrieved black employee. If you're caught in some piece of misbehavior for which you're fired, but a white employee was caught with the same misbehavior and was not fired, that makes it obvious that you're being dismissed, same misconduct, well, the difference is my race. And the same sort of thing applies when 2 people go for a promotion and the only apparent difference is one's a man and one's a woman, and they promote the man. If there's not a better argument than that, then it looks like illegal discrimination on the basis of sex under Title VII. So this Title VII permits you to use employment tests, but the tests can't be used, designed, or intended to be proxies for illegal discrimination. And also put some limits on how you can game or score the results of those tests, in general trying to prevent employers from running the tests and then getting the results that they want. Now, the easiest way to think of this is the intentional discrimination side. This is what most people intuitively understand is being driven by bias or prejudice. I think of it as the old school side of these discrimination statutes. Title VII prevents the intentional discrimination. We give some examples here. If you still had such a practice that if you received a black or perhaps more commonly Hispanic applicant and you sent them for reading testing or English language testing, but you had non-black or non-Hispanic applicants and you did not so send those people, you've lost a Title VII case. You cannot preferentially select. Now, you can run a genuine test that says you must have language proficiency. And every single applicant that comes in the door has to demonstrate that language proficiency. But you can't preferentially select a person based on national origin, color, or any other prohibited category. One of the harder things to hide here that people come after is that this applies to the female applicants as well, and this is often the problem when you're running a physical strength test. Often you'll have a person who, in good faith, meaning without deliberate intent to discriminate, is sort of running some kind of an eye test and saying, you need to go to testing, you're probably fine, you probably need testing, you're probably fine. That's bad. That manager is costing you a Title VII claim and probably a loser at that. And also, we have some of these, I think of them as good old boys, let's just say outstate somewhere, who they make everybody do something, kind of a homebrew test, and they and their buddies figure out who they're going to hire based on how they all run, jump, and cavort. You can't do that either. Whether you're using that for whatever reason, that's probably not a legitimate employment test. But we do sometimes still see a person who's doing that. I have all my applicants run the stairs down at the local high school, up and down the stadium, and then we decide who we're going to hire. That looks a lot like you're screening out people of a particular national origin, a particular race, a particular sex. It's not really normed and validated in the way that would help you to survive a challenge. A little bit more on disparate treatment. The way, and there's slides again, the materials are outside, but the attack on one of these cases is the person first has to show, I was treated differently. So the very first thing is the threshold. Is that even true? Was there really some different treatment? Or is that just the person thinks that, but our statistics show that it wasn't? You can win it if there's really no disparate treatment. But if there is disparate treatment, then you may have a problem. And the fastest route to a problem is if you have some manager or someone making a discriminatory statement. These little ladies can't hack it. We don't need anybody from those countries. You've got to take care that you don't have those kinds of folks in your system, but that's the shortest route to losing one of these cases. But even if there's not evidence like a discriminatory statement, there are still ways that a plaintiff can win these cases and the employer can lose. And one of the straightforward without discriminatory intent is when you have no valid explanation that holds water, when you have no rationale for why you're running the test that you're running. It doesn't appear to be a legitimate approach to the actual job duties. If you are upside down there, if you can't make a reason for the difference in treatment that holds water that will withstand scrutiny, you're likely to lose the case. And then in particular, if the reason that you give turns out not to be true, then you're almost certainly dead in the water, because telling a lie allows the court or the jury to draw the inference that you have a real reason, and it's not the reason that you gave, it's probably the illegal reason. And that inference, so that means you don't want to give this untrue rationale. The other thing that I mentioned on this disparate situation here with the disparate impact, this is the second half. You're not running a test that you're intending to only screen out blacks or Hispanics or certain national origin. You're not trying to get rid of people over a certain age. That'd be discriminatory, as we'll talk about in a minute. But instead, you're running some sort of a test that nevertheless has that effect. That's called disparate impact. It's not disparate treatment, and this is a little bit less intuitive. This disparate impact is a little bit harder to understand at first blush, but the idea is the same. You can't be doing something that has the practical effect of denying hiring, promotion, dismissal to an entire category of people if it's not based on legitimate business necessity. And so what you end up showing here is that even in the absence of any requirement of discriminatory intent, there doesn't have to be any showing by the EEOC or the plaintiff that you intend to discriminate. The employer can still lose this. And these are sort of issues that come into play. First, you're trying to see if does the employer use a particular practice that in effect has this disparate impact? This is the same as the initial thought, is it really happening? Again, the plaintiff might be wrong here. You may have statistics that demonstrate that in practice, there is no disproportionate effect, or it's not a significant impact. There are very slight differences, but they're within the expectations or within the law of averages. If that's the case, you're going to be fine. But if you have a practice that does disproportionately screen out folks, applicants in particular, who are in a particular category, then you have to move on to the next step. And that is, you have to demonstrate that the test that you're running is job-related and that it's consistent with business necessity. So you can't use a test to get rid of people on the basis of their not having a skill or an ability that has nothing to do with the job. So you can't be running an IQ test where the IQ of the person beyond read and write and speak, it matters. You can't run a physical ability test that goes beyond the routine or necessary aspects of the job. You can't run a credit check or any of these other tests, really, but for our purposes, a physical test, causing people to lift 250 pounds 5 times. Can you bench 250 pounds? Who cares? It has nothing to do with my sedentary office job. The extreme example seems obvious, but the traps are where folks are running tests because they like the results of the people that are screened out, but they don't really have an ability to show that that matters to the job duties. And then that looks like discrimination on the basis of disparate impact. You have to show that it's necessary to get this information and for the person to be able to do this in order for the safe and efficient operation of the job or the workplace. And that's going to vary by job, obviously. It's going to vary by industry and work location, the tools that are available, the setup, and it may even vary from year to year within the exact same location. The trickiest part of this test is that even if you can show that you have to use some sort of test, and it is having this discriminatory impact, it's having this disproportionate impact, the EEOC or the courts will make you show that there's no other less discriminatory alternative. So you're saying, well, no, I do have a good reason for making them have to do this, and I just can't help it that 0% of the ladies can pass and 100% of the men can pass. They'll say you might need to find a different test that goes at the same core competency that you're shooting for, but that has a fairer chance for women than 0%. They'll make you look for and demonstrate that there's no less discriminatory alternative. So those are the basic rules. They arise from Title VII. Title VII originally, sex and race, national origin. Conspicuously absent from that list to the modern sensibility is age. And that was corrected in a different statute, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act from 1967. And what the ADEA did, in effect, was to just elevate this concept of age as its own protected category. It added it to the list, which wasn't there in Title VII, like national origin. The age needs a cutoff, and they used over 40. And so it's a kind of a moment of sadness whenever you quit being a kid and you come into the protected age category and you think, wow, I'm old now, like legally I'm old, I'm over 40, I'm in the protected age category. They're worried that these younger whippersnappers will be discriminating against old guys like me. And then you start to think, wait, 40 isn't very old. But I guess it's all relative, right? So I remember that feeling, but now I think, well, 40 is not very old. So under the ADEA, you can't do any of the same things we've been talking about on the basis of age, just like you wouldn't be able to on the basis of race or sex. So you can't disproportionately send folks off or discriminatorily send folks off. You couldn't, for example, run a test and say, well, I only required this physical agility test. You only have to run the cones and the shuttle run if you're over 50. And I've just decided that people who are over 50 need to go demonstrate their prowess, but everybody else gets a pass. That is an age discrimination lawsuit that you will lose. Differential treatment tends to show that you have a bias or a prejudice. You're not demonstrating there's an actual need to run the test. You're just deciding that since the person's over 50 or any other protected category, over 40 in this case, you're making them run the test. So that disparate treatment works the same way. And they also have a very similar, not identical, but a very similar concept of disparate impact. A disparate impact test can also lose you a discrimination suit. So this applies to physical testing. It's not limited to physical testing, but impact, of course, becomes very touchy with age. You may have a greater and greater proportion of applicants who are higher and higher in age who are unable to perform the legitimate requirements of a physical test. You're almost automatically going to see what looks like a disparate impact because they're likely to fail it at a higher rate than the people who are not in the protected category. The folks in their 20s and 30s that you get as applicants might very well have a higher passage rate That in and of itself is not discriminatory, but it raises one of those yellow flags, and you have to be ready to show that this challenged action is based on, in this case, they soften it a little bit and say a reasonable factor other than age. But it's much the same as legitimate business reason and consistent with business necessity. So you have to take a look and see that it's not simply the age that's being chosen, and you need a reasonable factor. It might correlate with age, but it's not supposed to be age. And you have to make that job relevant, not simply something that you prefer. But the hardest of these expansions of the categories of protected individuals has been much more recent. 1990 was when the first Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And much more recently, there's been an extension called the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, which some people call the ADAAA. I refuse to say ADAAA. I just like to say ADA at best. So 1990, and so it demonstrates that much of a generation had gone by as they wrestled over the race and sex and age before they added this category. And the intent was to elevate your physical condition, your disability, your disabling condition, to the same kind of protected category as age or race or sex, and to say that too can't be used as the basis for making an employment decision, whether a refusal to hire or a dismissal. It's trickier. It's quite straightforward in terms of outlawing it. It says that private sector employers and state and local governments can't discriminate against qualified individuals who have disabilities. You can't use the fact that this person has a disabling condition as a reason not to hire them, and it makes decisions on that basis illegal. I guess the easiest way to understand it from the front end is that poster child for something like this is there's the Tom Hanks movie, someone finds out he has cancer or someone finds out he has AIDS, and they want him fired from their law firm. That's bias, that's prejudice. A person has a disabling condition and you want rid of them on that basis, you can't, that's illegal. Another way to think of it is you've got this beautiful, kind of the poster child is a beautiful, intelligent, well-spoken teacher. The person happens to be in a wheelchair. Someone has bias and prejudice against having a cripple teacher, okay? And so they want rid of that person. And there's really no job relevance to this. Certainly something that you should be able to accommodate. So far, so good, but to say that you can't use a person's physical requirements or physical limitations as the reason to let them go makes no sense at all in a warehouse kind of a situation, or maybe in a truck driver situation or a bus driver. There's all kinds of jobs where it does matter. And this is a little more fluid, typically, than age, which is pretty much fixed and is always counting up at 1 year per year for most people. Sex, traditionally, at least 1960s, pretty straightforward. National origin, you're usually only from the one country. And so this is something that's not as immutable as those. And it's something you usually have to get a doctor involved and try and figure out the exact contours of a person's limitation. So this whole area is legally fraught. Trying to find out a person the extent of their limitations and exactly what they can and can't do under the ADA is a little bit like trying to find out exactly what race they are, precisely what part of what country their parents are from, which gives you an icky feeling, right? Because we're conditioned to say you don't need to know that. There isn't any real job requirement to find that out. So we're in this overlap here of asking questions that we need the answers to, but that go into an area that if we have the information and we make a decision based on that, we might be violating a discriminatory statute. So the ADA specifies times when you can and times when you can't make these kinds of inquiries into what ends. So let's talk first about applicants, and I think this is the primary thing that Kurt was talking about. This is a person who does not yet work at your facility, and you're allowed to run certain kinds of physical tests after you've decided that you're otherwise fine with hiring this person. So you do your interviewing, you do your reference checks, you decide that this person has, on paper, the skills, they've met with you, it all looks good. You make them an offer. Now, that offer can be conditional on them being able to lift 50 pounds or whatever, but you don't do that before. You're not able to screen them in or out on the front end. That's the same as saying no blacks or no Muslims or no Hispanics. And you have to do it for everyone that's going into that job. It has to be a routine part of getting that job. If you're going to be a warehouse laborer or if you're going to be a UPS delivery person, then you have to go get the 50 pounds. It's not just because we noticed you came in with a cane. It's not just because we noticed you are almost as bald as me, and so we're shunting you out. You can't do that. You have to make that a qualification. It has to be post-offer, and it has to be for everyone entering the same job category. Not everyone entering employment at your company. There's no need to test certain categories. In fact, it might be discriminatory to test certain categories if there's no business justification for it, if there's no necessity. But you do have to test everyone entering that job category. Either that's a requirement of that job or it's not. Picking and choosing who you're going to apply that rule to demonstrates discriminatory intent. Now, with respect to current employees, and there was a question earlier from the back, this gets harder. And as Kurt said, when you don't have the front-end kind of expectation and broadly applicable rule, it begins to look like that individual decision-making. But the ADA does, at least in some of the regulations, take some pity on the employer and give you some opportunity rather than put all the marbles there. And that is, with respect to a current employee, you can ask questions about an apparent disability, or you can send them for a medical examination under these kinds of conditions. It's the same phrasing that I've been using this whole time. Job-related. Not simply, hey, Sally, I noticed that you were going to the doctor the other day. I'm just curious. No. No, it has to be job-related, not really juicy. Okay? It doesn't have to do with something we really, really, really want to know and we're in the position to ask. It has to be job-related. Can you actually perform the functions of the job? And it has to be consistent with business necessity. The idea is, yeah, it's about the job, but it also has to be something that matters to the performance of the essential functions. Not simply a prurient interest, trying to find out whether someone's pregnant, trying to see what medicines they're taking, trying to find out what their prescriptions are. The stuff has to be job-related. And in most cases, what you'll find is that the underlying situation, like the diagnosis, is irrelevant. What matters is the limitations, if any, the functionality of the person. Can they run the 10 miles an hour? It doesn't really matter why they can't. Either they can or they can't. Either your job needs for it to happen or not. In most cases, you need to think in terms of that ability to do the job, not the salacious details about why or why not. That's in most cases. Now, there's this entire category of reasonable accommodation, which can fill up another 45-minute presentation all on its own. But for our purposes, we're mostly looking at the physical testing, especially on the front end, and the ADA follows similar rules. In the materials that are out there on the table, I have another slide that gives you 3 other things that, with the regulations cited, that the ADA allows or does not allow. A couple of things there. You can't use one of these tests that has the impact of screening people out, so they include a disparate impact. Although, again, it says unless you can show that it's job-related and is consistent with business necessity. There's this second here in the middle of the page, which basically is the EEOC or the ADA's regulatory specification of what I was just saying. It's not so much about what the person's limitations are in the abstract or for your own interest. It's what effect they have on the job, and that it has to be job-related, tuned to the requirements of the job. And this third part is a little bit of the reasonable accommodation. And as I mentioned, that's a source of voluminous claims, but that's more for another day. One of the ways to sort of summarize that last part about the reasonable accommodation, and I'll take a few minutes to do that if I don't try your patience too much. The employer wants the employee on the job. The employee wants the employer on the task. You don't want them talking. You don't want them selling Avon. You don't want them doing anything but working. But in practice, most humane employers also recognize that folks get up, they go get a drink of water, they come back. They don't get fired for it. They get up, they go to the bathroom, they come back. They usually don't get docked. You may have had smokers in the past who get up, they take a smoker's break, maybe 15 minutes. You kind of let them go down there and come back. Usually they're not written up. Smoking is so much less prevalent today that the example doesn't go as far as it used to, but at any rate. Religious accommodation is easier to understand, and it goes all the way back to Title VII of 1964. If you have a person who needs an out every so often to go and say a prayer, or to go and make a religious observance, or to miss a certain day or a certain hour of work, and it's not very different from a smoker's break or a bathroom break, the expectation is you need to let them. If you won't let them just because of their religion, that's bias and prejudice against their religion. And the ADA carries that same concept forward. If you have a person who can generally do the job, but they have to get up every so often and stretch their legs or walk around the building or go outside or get away from the smell or whatever it might be, if it's not very different from a restroom break, or if it's a diabetic person who needs to go have something to eat, you're supposed to let them do it if you would generally let a religious accommodation or even some other practical reason. That's the kind of core of the reasonable accommodation, although it's a 2-minute version of what could be an all-day presentation. I told you that there are a couple things I'll do here at the end as my time is about to run. I mentioned that Kurt was really honing in on how to validate these tests and set them up correctly. And a lot of that's drawn from this uniform guidance that the federal government has had out now for decades, going back to 1978, so notably pre-ADA. But these standards still apply, and if you can work your way into a defensive position, you're ahead of the game. Conversely, if you're thinking of tests that you run at your employer, at your place of employment, and you have some doubt whether you could satisfy these tests, you need to rethink what you're doing. Having everyone run up and down the stairs at the bleachers while we get a good look at them coming and going, and then we decide who we're going to hire, is not going to pass the EEOC's validation test. However, if you have a test that can be shown to measure what you say you're measuring, that means you're going to pass the first test. And if your test shows that whatever it's measuring is actually job related and is relevant to the positions and duties and functions of that position, you're going to pass the second part. And the criterion is the hardest because here you get into kind of statistics. This is a little bit like I have a kid taking the SAT and the ACT this fall. And those tests are normed and they're just really validated with statistical information. They're constantly comparing one cohort to another, and they have very large numbers to demonstrate that no matter what you think you should have gotten, the score you got can't be changed or beat. That's the hardest part to do yourself in a homebrew type test, because that's the third part of the EEOC's, the criterion testing. And that's where you're best off using something that's out of the box from a vendor, from a reputable vendor. The other section here that we've talked about a little bit, I know this is less intuitive, is that disparate impact. Not disparate treatment. Most people understand disparate treatment, the prejudicial treatment, quite well. But the disparate effect or impact that a test might be having. And this is all based on rates. And again, this material is out there on the table, but the idea is what's the passage rate or the failure rate between different groups of applicants? And those groups are clustered by over 40 and under 40 or male-female or on any of the basis of these protected categories. And then they're going to look at the relative ratio, the percentage pass rate as a percentage of the other group's pass rate. And when that difference is significant, then they're going to say that's an adverse impact. There's no hard and fast rule. This 80% makes it sound like there's a hard and fast rule, but this is maybe more of a guideline. But I have a couple of cases that I'll show you.
So, can I stop?
Yeah, please.
You're saying we should track that data,
Yes,
what you're saying in that.
I am saying that.
You got 100 applicants, rejected 90 over the course of, a year or whatever. Somebody comes in, you better have those grouped into what, if you get that slide before, grouped into, the group and measure the difference.
That's right. You do need to have that information. And guys, it's defensive as well. If a person comes in and says, I think that this test screened me out on the basis of my protected category, age over 40, sex as a woman, or whatever else, you're going to say that's not what this test does. This test measures your legitimate ability to perform the job. We don't have any race test or sex test. Okay, that's fine. So then they're going to say, I think that what it is a hidden way of getting rid of people who are. And so then you're going to have to delve into your rates and find out if the relative rate of passage is disproportionate. Now, maybe it's not. And as I mentioned, at the front end, you might actually say, you're wrong, lady. It's actually about 50% of the people that actually come in off the street can pass this, and you just can't. But it's like 45% of the women and 55% of the men can. And if those are your stats, you're going to win. But if you go, we can't really say who passes it or how often, that doesn't work as a defense. Like, you want to have that information, or else you only have her word against nothing. You have their assertion, and they'll probably gin up 2 other unsuccessful applicants, And then you'll have now if you've got fantastic, if everyone that works on your floor is a female, then her case isn't going to go anywhere. But if everyone who works on your floor is a male, you have deep trouble. Now, if you've only ever had 3 female applicants, maybe that's not enough. Maybe that's not enough to have a reasonable sample size. Maybe there isn't enough statistical validity. But what if you don't know if you've only ever had 3 applicants? You need that information so that you and your attorney can go through and look where you're going to defend and how. Yes, ma'am.
So I have a question on that real quick though, because this is alfalfa, which I understand that you're sending them. But you may not have a lot of that data. I don't necessarily know how old the person is if I'm sending them for a test. We haven't gotten that far, or, depending on where you are, a background check, or I might not know they have a disability. So are you gonna have that data to back that up?
Two questions I would say, two thoughts that are there. The first is, generally, an employment application, you're likely to have a sense of the person's age, although coming right out and asking for date of birth and social security number is sometimes fraught with looking like you're trying to screen out someone on the basis of age. But often by the time you're making an offer of employment, you do have some sense of the person's, you're through the application and you're through the interview or whatever your intake. On the other hand, disability is very difficult. This disability is one that you very often will not know. And unless you're getting a request for an accommodation, you don't even want to know. You don't even want to inquire into that. So it may be that you can say, legitimately, if they're bringing in an ADA claim on the basis that they're in a protected category under the concept of discrimination, and they're being screened out disproportionately, you can say, we don't keep that data, we don't have any way to know that. But I can tell you that it's not disproportionate on the basis of sex, it's not disproportionate on the basis of race, it's not disproportionate on the basis of the age, and EEOC, we're great, we're really good. We try hard, we're EEO, we do all the stuff we're supposed to do, rather than we don't have it. We don't have it seems kind of like no comment. It doesn't usually carry the day the way that you would like. I'm going to talk about 2 cases. One's very old, one's very new. Well, very old, 2006, so it's not exactly cutting edge. This is a case, when you see the EEOC on the front end here, what this means is that the EEOC sued, not an individual employee. The EEOC, whenever they get a hold of a complaint that they think is really strong, they'll sometimes take the lawsuit themselves. And that flips the kind of measure that a lot of times that the employer is using to think about how many resources does the plaintiff's lawyer have, or how long will the plaintiff's lawyer spend time on this proportionate to what they think the recovery might be. If the EEOC is bringing the suit, you got the federal government, and they can print money. They've got a budget for this year and for next year. And they know that next year's budget will be bigger if they exhaust this year's budget, Not if they keep a whole lot of reserves. They'll make it look like they don't need so much money for next year. So this is a problem. The statistics that the EEOC found, and I don't know that the employer had them right off the top of their head or whether the employer had to engage in voluminous discovery and go back and look at every application over the past 2 or 3 years, and then someone found this information. They were challenging a strength test that had been imposed by the employer at some point. They didn't have it before, and then they imposed this test. And what the EEOC challenged was that back in the day before the test, 46% of the people that they hired were women. But after they imposed this test, only 15% of the people that were hired were women. That's not even a passage rate of the test. They're just showing that adding this test really cut down how many women they were hiring from 1 in 2 to about 1 in 8. And they said, that looks like discrimination. Employer, it's your turn to defend that now. Legitimate business reasons, necessity. The employer scrambled because they didn't have it, and the best they could say was, we got a whole lot less injuries now on the job. Hardly anybody gets hurt now. That wasn't enough for the EEOC, or for the trial court, or for the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals. They also said, you're doing a whole lot of things that might be bringing down the injury rate. You're training better, the rotation, the way that you're moving people around, it's less repetitive. You're doing all sorts of things to cut down on that. This test, though, this crosses the line and goes beyond. So, imposing this strength test, the employer failed in this case because they weren't able to demonstrate that that test was job-related and consistent with business. It may have had good results, like it might have had a positive effect, but it's not enough of a defense to say, now that we don't hire Hispanics anymore, or now that we don't hire Muslims anymore, we got a whole lot less arguments, and that doesn't work. You can't use something you gauge as a beneficial result as a discriminatory motive. So they said that this disproportionate impact and the failure of having a strong business justification on the front end cost that employer. And I put this out because the Eighth Circuit is the Circuit Court of Appeals immediately below the Supreme Court of the United States, and it covers Missouri, Iowa, and surrounding states. For most of our cases that we would ever see, the Eighth Circuit is as high as it goes, and that was 12-year-old precedent. This newest case is from this June, just over the summertime. And the EEOC brought this suit a couple of years ago about a physical test that a railroad company was applying to all applicants for a variety of jobs. And they actually challenged 2 or 3 different tests. One of them was I thought it was interesting, the isokinetic test that Kurt mentioned earlier. These isokinetic tests are sort of like physiology. They're like exercise science, very cutting edge. Can you do this specific motion, and can you do it if it progressively gets stronger all the way across the range of motion, everything? Very unlike a typical job duty. So it strains people out, but it's not obvious that it has a legitimate one-to-one connection with a particular job duty. And they had 2 other tests. One was like just an aerobic capacity. I heard him mention the VO2 max. And the other one was a general kind of upper body strength and lower body strength, and it wasn't isokinetic. And I didn't get all of the statistics, but they had significantly lower pass rates for females than males. And I mean significantly lower. The tests were hard enough that 87% of the men passed one test, but only 30% of the women could test. So it was almost 3 times as many, which is eye-opening enough for the EEOC's purposes. And there was another where only half of the women could pass it, but almost all of the men could pass it. And it's something like a flexed arm hang or a pull-up or something that men's bodies are somewhat better designed to do than women's bodies are designed to do. But it wasn't clear that this was important to the job. It was somewhat related in that it was kind of strength related, but they hit them again on what is an alternative test that you could use that wouldn't cut this passage rate to half of what the men's are, or 1/3 of what the men's are, and would still see if you can load trucks or unload shelves. And they didn't have something. They didn't have a better explanation for it, and they had to pay over $3 million into a settlement fund this summer. They had Jones Day. This is a big company. They had big-time lawyers. They had all the training that you would need, and they said, we'll pay the money. Now, they didn't admit liability, so I guess they have that going for them, but they stopped using the tests, and they agreed to bring in some outside experts to help them set up the tests the right way. So you have to show not only that it's job-related and consistent with business necessity, but if it's going to have this disproportionate impact, you're going to have to show that there's no reasonable alternative. The EEOC guidance, which is, again, this underlined here at the bottom of these 2 slides, and that's the next to the last page outside, gives away some best practice, things to do, things not to do. Most of these would be fairly redundant to what we've talked about, but make sure that you're applying the test to everybody that comes into that job category or job class or job title, all applicants. Make sure that it's job related to the actual duties of that position. So not enough to say that we work in a train station or we work in a warehouse. If this is a phone answering job and the heaviest thing you ever lift is a handset, you can't just say, well, to work in the warehouse, you need to be able to lift 50 pounds. No. Does this job require that? And then you've got to look for those alternatives, and that's what this case is about. The other thing that I would mention here on these last couple of slides is you can set this up well. It can be really good for a set of circumstances that no longer apply after the passage of time. At one point, it was really valid and normative to have this, but since that time, we've brought in forklifts, or since that time, we brought in drones, and you're still testing to get rid of people, and you no longer have that business necessity. So you need to keep it up to date and refreshed, maybe not every year, but certainly you don't want it to be so out of date that it's no longer defensible under your current situation. So I'll take any other questions that you guys have right here in the front.
There is some concern that when you apply by computer,
Yes.
that the algorithms in the computer may be such that they weed out, non-traditional names, et cetera. Are you seeing that in reality, or is that just concerns right now?
Well, I'm not seeing it's funny because what was mentioned before, everyone's looking for people now. I mean, and if anything, people are relaxing their standards. And so we're actually seeing less jilted applicant kind of cases than we were getting in the first place. before, when unemployment was much higher and jobs were harder to get, we saw a real upswell in people saying, I was dinged for my national origin, or I was dinged for a non-traditional name, or whatever. So just as a current practice, I'm not seeing very many of those kinds of challenges at all. But the same criteria would have to apply, and it gets into that statistical norming. Is the computer actually guilty of having a disparate impact against people whose names have too many vowels, or Bosnians, or whatever it might be, down South City? And if so, is there some less, but it might be the person thinks that's why and that's not why. That's why you need those statistics, But I haven't personally seen a whole lot of that, but I remember when there were a lot of jilted applicant lawsuits. There were a lot of those, and they're very difficult. Another question right here? Yes?
You touched on smoking earlier. I know that's obviously a very sensitive subject, but we're allowed now to charge more to a tobacco user. We're allowed to go to a smoke-free campus, but we can't discriminate solely based on whether or not they smoke or use tobacco. Some employers, however, can. BJC here in town does not hire tobacco users. And they claim that it's because of what they do. They're, obviously trying to profess health and whatnot. But there's a direct correlation to a smoker and absenteeism and cost to a health plan. So technically speaking, it impacts every employer. So why is it that we all cannot draw the line and say we just won't hire tobacco users?
Well, that's a policy question, right? You could very well say, I'd be for that. One of the things that we do is, in my job, we also represent quite a lot of colleges and universities, like literally higher education institutions, or even for that matter, school districts. We represent a number of public school districts. And I make this joke quite a lot. You can walk into a PetSmart, and you can see a sign on the door that says, everyone that works in this PetSmart has been subject to a random drug test. But you can never walk into a school district and see a sign that says that. Now, why is that? Why would we say that you can randomly drug test people who work at PetSmart, but you can't randomly drug test teachers, but they won't let you randomly drug test teachers? And partly it's the Constitution, invasion of privacy, search and seizure, Fourth Amendment, governmental employer versus private sector employer. So I'm going to bring it back to your question. There's a Missouri statute that says that you can't use off-duty conduct that's lawful conduct as a reason to discriminate against an applicant, lawful conduct. So a person who's over the age and drinks off of the job or smokes off of the job, there's an actual Missouri statute on the books that says that you can't use that as the basis to discriminate against unemployment. Without that statute, their rights would be different. Someone at some point decided, the outstate legislators, let's go ahead and pass this drinking and smoking law, right? But like many of these that we've talked about, if you have a business justification and you can show that there's a legitimate business necessity, you can overcome some of these kind of generally you can't, thou shalt not. And I would suspect, without having defended them, that the BJC argument is falling into that category. The unique circumstances here of having these people with compromised immune systems and all that kind of stuff makes it important more so than this generally applicable statute in our case. But I'm with you, a lot of these are just the policy descriptions. Remember, prior to 1990, there was no ADA. After 1990, there is. Much later, they passed that ADA Amendments Act. They tried to broaden the scope of who's covered, and they're always tinkering with this kind of stuff. The courts do it as well. Title VII outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, color, national origin, and sex, but not sexual orientation. Sex. Since 1964, there's been an explosion of this concept of gender and all these concepts of genders and between genders and transgenders and all these things. Are those covered or not covered? In Illinois, they are. In Missouri, they're not. In the city of St. Louis, they are. And in various courts of appeals in the United States, different courts have reached that they are or that they're not. And in California, they are. And in Mississippi, they're not. And that's just the way that it goes. I mean, it's an imperfect world. So I can't do better than that. I'll take one more question. Oh, no one else wants to get dressed down. Yes, ma'am.
This goes back a little ways. So if you have a maintenance man that comes in for employment, you don't do any testing, he gets hurt off the job, you bring him back, and you were talking about sending him to be checked.
Right.
Is that showing?
The answer is you probably can do it. Okay.
Because you didn't test him prior to, so.
That's right.
Are you making a point by?
Kurt is saying it correctly it's so much easier if you have that standard from the beginning. But I'll go back to this slide. If you have a current employee, you can ask questions or you can send them for a medical exam if it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. So, for example, if you have a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that they might not be able to perform the job, so let's take your maintenance man. He was hurt off the job. He missed a significant amount of work. He's broken a leg, strained his back, whatever it is, he had surgery. And you now have objective evidence to demonstrate that you sincerely wonder whether he really is going to be able to perform the strenuous actions that are required as a maintenance man. Under the ADA, you probably can send him for an exam. In fact, that's how I got this speaking gig. I was helping a law firm who had a office manager who was out for quite a while, and that office manager position was one that we were going through this analysis right now. Can we send this person out? Do we have sufficient objective evidence that they may have a limitation? And then we were looking at the job duties and tasks and seeing, is it reasonable to say this person might be compromised? And in those cases, you can send them for a fit for duty test, sometimes called a functional capacity assessment, try and figure out whether they can perform the job. But you better have some backup that the job requires certain kinds of physical parameters.
So you couldn't, when they would come back to work, you couldn't take your job description and say, we're going to send you here to...
You can.
And you would be well within, you wouldn't be showing discrimination.
Now, if you're well within, but you're very arguably within, and you have to be able to demonstrate that it's a legitimate basis, what will happen is they'll claim that you found out that they have a condition and now you're biased against them or you're prejudiced or you want to move on. And they'll also add that it's age, and they'll add any national origin or anything else they can tack on. And you're going to have to defend that that's not it. By all means, if you're able to do the job, we want to keep you. But the job is strenuous, and we feel that there's some danger. You need some objective reasons why. You gave us a doctor's note. The doctor said you're on light duty until the end of December. We have our concerns. And in those cases, it's not kryptonite. It's not radioactive. You generally can go forward if you have...
Would you be better off to let them come back and then see your problems?
You know, the answer is always it depends, but I don't like to have them come in and injure themselves. I would much prefer to take the stand and say, for your own safety and all that. Now, in a given situation, very flimsy evidence on the front end, it might be that you come in and you want to make some observations that they're woozy or they're unsteady on their feet or they proclaim that they're not able to get through the day, and then pull them out and send them for testing. Because what you need is the objective evidence. And if you have it, I would use it. And if you don't have it and feel like you need to try and create it, that's okay. But you have to err on the side of human safety too. If you're worried that the person can't perform the job, I don't want to put them into position, you're really afraid. Quick side note. We sometimes have an employee that comes to work and we think they're impaired, like under the influence of drugs or alcohol. We're like, look at this person, they seem like they're buzzed. The last thing I want to do is say, man, you're too drunk to work. You need to get in your car and drive home. So you don't want to do that, right? So if we're going to say that we think that you're limited and that we're bona fide concerned that you can't perform the job, we don't necessarily want to put you on the job to watch and see if you fail. But you have to go through what's called an interactive process with the employee, and it's very individualized. Okay, any other questions?
You have to be consistent too with other employees similarly like that. So
That's a great point. That's a great point. In the back?
Best time to implement a return to work physical ability test. So it seems like in the fire district, obviously anybody is over 40 years old. So anytime you talk about implementing a return to work test, right away discrimination comes up. There's a test that we require all new applicants to come in. It's a national certified test. Is that a test that we can give our applicants that have gone out on work injury or off work injury?
I like the idea in the abstract. Again, I don't know all of your facts, but if it's a national test and it's normed for applicants, and so it is tuned in the 3 ways, it tests what it says it's going to test, the testing is actually for something that matters to the job, and third, you have the statistical validity, which I'm going to assume, then that's a strong selection to use. And if it's already in place, and this is something that Kurt and I both liked, if it's already in place and you're using it as a return to work, it's a great gatekeeper. So in the abstract, without knowing the specifics, I like that test. In fact, it'd be harder in my mind to justify getting away from it and using something else. But you could do that if you had specific worries of a person had a heart condition or whatever the specific, objective, individualized things were. So you might send them for some additional testing. But in the abstract, I like that. He also mentioned what's the right time to impose one of these new tests, like when they rolled out the strength test and all of a sudden the number of applicants that were female that were successful or hires. Well, there's no great time, but there are some really terrible times. So like right when a person goes out and then you try and impose it is going to look like it's retaliation or it's reactive. Whereas if you can do it in the abstract when no one's out right now, then it's not as personal. If you can do it when you're rolling out another employee manual, or you've updated your employee handbook, or you've got this new no-compete or whatever, and then in addition to that, we're also imposing these kind of rigmarole and all that kind of, the more that you can bury it in with the other stuff and make it look like it's a routine revamping and less about you, the better. And in some cases, if your real goal is to change from exempt to non-exempt because of wage and hour, go from salaried to hourly because of overtime, add this strength testing because of fitness for duty, the employee doesn't know what it is. You roll those things out, you change your work week, you issue the new personnel manual, you put the salespeople under their no-competes, and a lot of times that's, whatever they assert was the illegal reason, you say, oh no, it was all this, it was all revamped, they were just caught up in it. So I think that that's the ideal time, is when no one's pending. But you need to do it on an individual basis at times, and there's no way around it. You have a person who needs to have it, and if that's your situation, you just have to bite the bullet. Any other questions? Don? Guys? Hey, I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shane and Kurt. I appreciate your time and all your efforts preparing and all that stuff. I appreciate all you guys coming. It's not easy. This stuff is hard stuff. But if you set it up the right way, you can save yourself from hiring this person. That's really it. There's some questionnaires on the tables. We would appreciate your feedback on today's seminar. Also, there's some marketing information and copies of the slides and everything out on the table. Thank you all very much for coming. We'll have another one in April, so hopefully we'll see you then.